So I want to share with you a little bit about my journey inside trying to predict population health and in general the future. But I wasn't the first one who tried to attempt this large quest. One of the first companies who was actually trying to predict future events and maybe future diseases was actually Google. They had this very basic idea. If you're looking for the word flu, and many people are searching for the word flu, there might be a flu outbreak. And they actually did an amazing task. They published this paper on Nature. They were capable of predicting flu outbreaks 2 to 3 weeks before the HMOs even noticed. Until one day, Google got flu wrong. And no, not because all of the people in the world are reading Nature, but actually something changed in this basic hypothesis. Something changed, and people, when searching for flu, stopped having the flu. Can somebody think what happened? Any ideas? So it turns out, I don't know if you remember, but in 2013, we had the swine flu. People started searching for the word flu, but not because they had the flu, but they were thinking that they might have the swine flu, trying to read this. And this is a lot of the problem in many of the things that we're doing today in data science. We're identifying really awesome correlations, but to actually predict the future's correlation is just not enough. And one of the main problems is that if you want to understand causality, which is what we actually want, causality is just not in the data, right? In order to understand causality, you need to perform an experiment. The problem is artificial intelligence is not alive, so it cannot perform an experiment. So what I started doing is trying to take everything humanity knows and all of the experiments that we were doing in the last hundreds of years and let the AI get access to this. Specifically, we got access to 150 years of news articles, billions of tweets, and millions of web searches. We then started applying deep natural language processing on different sentences. So in this case, US Army bombs the weapon warehouse in Kabul with missiles. The system actually identifies who did the action, the US Army, the bombing that was performed in a weapon warehouse in Kabul with missiles. It then looks for cues in the data. So somebody actually said this causes something else, this happened after. So in this case, this caused 5 Afghan troops to be killed. Eventually, we ended up with what we call a causality graph. It's a graph of 300 million nodes and billions of edges representing everything we know about causality. At that time, I was working with the Gates Foundation. They asked, can we use this amazing causality graph to try to predict Ebola? Now, Ebola didn't happen many times in human beings, but it did happen a few dozen of times in animals. So just using different correlation analysis, we just didn't have enough data to actually predict this. But using this causality graph, we started revealing a very interesting pattern. And what I really love about this, it's a very good biblical story because it turns out that most Ebola outbreaks start when humans are greedy and looking for diamonds and gold. This is the actual news article the system picked up. So it turns out that when people are looking for diamonds and gold, the system knows that deforestation is about to happen. The system knows that when deforestation happens, animals are going to migrate. But specifically, one type of animal, the bat. And indeed, the latest Ebola outbreak happened because of a 3-year-old child who ate an uncooked bat bushmeat and killed more than 2,000 people. And this is where it got me all thinking. If you think about it, how do we researchers work? We have this amazing hypothesis, right? At least we think it's amazing. Then we test it for 3 to 5 years. If it works, amazing, we have a new drug. We're making billions if we build a good company about this. And if not, well, goodbye. But the really good inventions, like X-ray or antibiotics, were all developed randomly. And my question is, are we willing to live in this randomness? Are we willing to let some random event happen that might cause us all to live or to die? And in the last few years, I've been focusing on trying to make automated medical breakthroughs using this system. Well, in other words, trying to replace myself as a researcher. Getting access to large data sets and letting the system actually think about hypotheses for me as a researcher to continue researching. So the first thing we started working with what's called the protein-protein interaction graph. This is everything that scientists were playing about, taking one protein, taking another one, testing if they have an interaction. So this is how the graph looked in 1990, this is how it looked in 95, this is how it looks in 2016. So I'm pretty sure that you see that it's growing. And I gave one of my PhD students an interesting task. Can you predict, giving two proteins, if they're going to interact with each other or not? He built this simple machine learning system, looking at the graph, and he got to an AUC of 96. I was like, oh my God. How is that even possible? You might have some kind of a data leakage. It's impossible without even knowing the chemical structure of those two proteins to try to predict what's going on. So I asked him to plot one interesting thing. I asked him to plot what's the probability of two proteins to interact with each other based on the distance that they had a year before this. And we see something very interesting, is that we're really good in predicting a year in advance two proteins that were pretty close the year before. This is a very interesting claim, but if you actually look at additional AUC graphs, you see the closer they are in this protein graph, the higher the probability that next year somebody's going to check them and maybe identify that they have an interaction. In other words, if you think about this, we all think that science is very random. This is why we give grants. You should do random research in order to identify something. But it turns out that something in our science is not random as we thought. It turns out that the community is actually searching in very specific ways their next discoveries. This is why we're so focused on very specific things. Why? Probably there's a trend. Everybody's now researching antibiotics, so everybody's checking whether two proteins in that field can be interacting. And we actually see this. We were trying to look at focus, the probability of attention of certain proteins. So you can see that some of them are gaining a lot of attention in a single year. In a single year, everybody's testing these two proteins. And then a year or two later, everybody's forgetting about those proteins. And it's happening time after time after time again. And if we look at how we study things, we see that some proteins are actually studied a lot. So this is what you see, but actually most of the graphs, most of the proteins are never studied at all. And this what's got us to what's been called in the pharmaceutical world the E-room law. So you know, Moore's law, every year technology is going to get smaller, cheaper, the world is pink, everything's going to get better. And specifically drug design, they have something called E-room law, which is the word Moore written the other way, which says that every year to develop a new drug is going to take twice the amount of time and twice the amount of money. And what I'm thinking, at least this is my personal claim, is the fact that it might be caused because we're too focused as scientists. We took all the low-hanging fruits for drugs, we already developed them. Now we need to be extremely creative. But how can you be extremely creative if you're not doing something very differently from what we're doing right now? The thing is, some drug treatment groups are tested for many diseases, while others are not even considered. And what we started doing is building a system that's going to try to automate a lot of this process and identify new drug interactions. For this, we started working with Maccabi Healthcare. We got access to 4 million patients for more than 20 years. We get access to their lab tests, doctor visits, and prescriptions. And we started building different types of models. Specifically, they asked us to predict which drugs should a patient above the age of 50 should be getting for hypertension. Now, it seems like a very simple machine learning problem. You just see what combinations work for other people, and work pretty well. You know what, the interesting thing, if you actually see the data, there's a protocol for treating hypertensive patients. It turns out that most doctors in Israel are not following the protocol, and not only that, they're doing treatment almost randomly, and more than that, they're right. It turns out the doctors who actually followed the protocol, their patients, their hypertension was reduced the slowest. And it turns out that you don't need genetics. You just need to see what the BMI of the person, other drugs they're taking. And then we started seeing something very interesting. That some drugs that they were taking were actually reducing their hypertension regardless of the drugs for hypertension. completely unrelated drugs. Some of them for if you have a bad stomach. And then we thought about a really interesting idea. Maybe the real way of creating something innovative for new drugs is to automatically build a system that's going to see whether a certain person was taking a certain drug and it helped him for a completely different disease. And if it happens in thousands of people, this might be a really good candidate. In other words, if you look at many cases for drug repurposing that you all probably know, for example, Viagra was developed for chest pains, etc. Eventually, they had a side effect, completely used for completely other things. The number one drug for AIDS is actually a chemotherapy drug that failed the clinical trials. So we started running the system, and we saw that there's hundreds of drugs people are taking for one cause, and it's actually helping them in completely different ones. And then we started seeing a lot of false positives. And I'll give you one. We identified that patients who are using liquid soap compared to regular soap, they have lower blood pressure. Wow, this is super interesting. You would think that using liquid soap is actually reducing hypertension. We'll, of course, know that there is no connection. So what is the connection? Age, exactly. The problem is you need to think to know this. You need to understand things. So certain things you can actually solve with matching, identifying different subgroups of people that are exactly identical, but the only thing which is different is that taking a certain drug differently. But then we identified this is not as simple as we think. The way we work with doctors is we would give them a drug and tell them, hey, it works for this disease. And I said, well, I don't know. Let me read a little bit of papers about this. So we said, well, why don't we do exactly the same thing? So we started getting access to 19 million articles coming from PubMed and millions of medical facts. And we started building a system that actually tries to reason and explain why this drug might work for this specific disease. Eventually, we built a graph connecting all of the drugs with different diseases and building kind of a walkthrough of explanations using Wikipedia graphs and PubMed graphs, etc. And then doing different types of random walks, and I'll show you a little bit about why this is hard. So the explanations look something like this. PPIs we see are helping hypertension. Why? Because it has been shown in the past that they're helping AD. But if you just walk randomly in this graph, you can get this type of explanations as well. For example, statins, they cost money, right? So they can be connected to United States dollars. United States dollars connected to United States. In the United States, you have hypertension. This is not exactly the explanation we've been expecting. The main problem is that there's many nodes here that are too general to even explain things. The next problem is if it is too long of an explanation, Occam razor, it's probably not right. So in this case, PPIs are causing Darunavir, causing HIV, and HIV has something to do with blood pressure. So in general, this is not as good as we wanted. The other thing that we wanted to do is actually identify path significance. If you look at this, we wanted the explanation for each path that you go through to be as explainable as possible given the previous steps. In other words, I don't want leaps of explanations that the doctor would have no idea why I got to them. So what we also encounter is the fact that we need each two explanations, like in this case, statins and rules of a statin, to be very connected from an NLP perspective. And then if you build all of this path and you build optimization functions, eventually you get to this type of explanations. We identified that statins were actually related to hypertension. This was also verified in a small clinical trial. And the explanation it eventually gave is statins are known to treat cardiovascular diseases. In other articles, cardiovascular diseases are very close to RAS, which is already known to be related to hypertension. Eventually, we identified several of those drugs, some of them in clinical trials, some of them we identified papers tried in other locations published after all of the experience we were doing. And 50% of the results that we were suggesting for this specific drugs were identified to be correct. But all of this was done in either retrospective or in a small clinical trial on 15 people. And I'll share with you one of the largest discoveries they did this year using these systems. Beta blockers. Beta blockers is a drug used by 25% of the population above the age of 50. This is a family of drugs. And in one of the times we said we don't only want to identify if beta blockers are helping other disease. By the way, beta blockers are very useful for hypertension, but we want to see whether, by mistake, it's causing some diseases. The system started running, and it actually showed us that it's causing Parkinson's disease. Very interesting, unknown connection. So it turns out that beta blockers, the way they're doing, they're closing a certain channel. That's not bad, right? The arteries are getting bigger, then the blood is moving. But it turns out that there's bodies called Guindy bodies. They don't know what to do with themselves. They start walking through the body, creating Guindy structures, which were eventually connected in different studies in the past to Parkinson's. All of this explanation I gave you, the system automatically produced from different medical articles. The way it did this, it identified that beta blockers, somebody did a really nice trial showing that some asthma drug is actually reducing Parkinson's. How does it do it? It showed exactly this connection with the Guindy bodies. The system only identified that beta blockers are doing exactly the opposite of this asthma drug, and they connected the dots for us. And this was, it turns out that the more you take beta blockers, you don't know that you're going to have the Parkinson immediately. But the longer you take it, because we have access to data for 20 years, it takes approximately 2 to 15 years to actually seeing the first results. And it more than doubles the probability of getting Parkinson's. One of my PhD students decided to be even more ambitious. He said, well, only taking an existing drug and seeing if it helps a completely different disease, it might work, it might not, but many of the times you need to change. And what he was trying to do is giving a molecule. There's a way of reproducing these molecules using Smiles notation, pretty much just writing the simple word, as you see on that side, and build a deep learner system that tries to actually produce a completely new drug, completely new molecule that he claimed, specifically Shahar Rel, if he's here in the crowd, that might be a good drug for something else. So we said, okay, you can train all the system on all of the drugs known till 1930. Create 1,000 molecules. Let's see manually. Maybe somebody after 1930 checked them and saw that it works for something. Because if you do this, the proof is in the pudding. So one of the things the system did, it took a drug called persinamide as input. This drug was went to the market in 1936. It was trying to actually treat tuberculosis. But it was toxic, so they stopped using it. The system made so many changes to its molecular structure. It changed more than 60% of its molecular structure and created a completely new molecule that in 1952, regardless of what the system, of course, said, went to the market and is now called isoniazid, the #1 drug by the World Health Organization used for tuberculosis. The more we started working with doctors and understood that we have a problem. If you think about this, you have a plane, you have a simulator. Before actually flying 300 people in a plane, first do some simulation. You don't take all of these people in a plane saying, let's fly, okay, it fall, okay, we should do something differently. But it turns out this is how it works in medicine. Just do experiments with people at a time. If you think about it, for 20 years we've been doing experiments with people here in Israel, and only now we're starting to do maybe some automation of this. And my question was, can we take all of the medicine they're studying in school and build actual simulators based on code that are going to simulate different properties and processes happening in the body? So what the system is doing is taking sentences like you see here. This is an example from Wikipedia where we're actually working on medical books and creating this type of simulator saying that high blood pressure are actually causing transfer of insulin to beta cells. So I'm going to show you a real screenshot coming from the system so you can see how much it's mature and immature in the same time. So in this case, insulin causes the liver to convert more glucose into glycogen. So the system is identifying a first event of conversion of glucose into glycogen. It's actually creating two variables. One is called glucose and glycogen, and it knows that one is going to be more if the other one is less. And it knows it has to happen before, as it says here, the forcing of body cells, primarily muscle and fat tissue cells, RBRB, that have to happen before a different event of taking glucose from the blood and turning it to a GLUT4 transporter, and by this decreasing the blood sugar. So in general, what the system is doing, identifying different variables happening in the data, creating code based on them, and then creating this type of processes with a version of a hidden Markov model with some probabilities. At this point, it's without. It's just creating what has to happen before another event in order to cause something else. So I'm showing you many things which are proof of concepts, right? A proof of concept for creating drug, a proof of concept for doing drug repositioning. But every time I was thinking, what is the lowest hanging fruit that we can take in order to make our lives different? And every time I was working with this type of hospitals, I would go inside the ER and I would always see how crowded it is. And you know, this is not a problem that's going to be solved, right? If you know, by 2030, approximately 4 billion people will have no access to primary health care. And if you don't have primary health care, more people are going to go to the ER, it's going to be even more overcrowded. And the problems today in healthcare are pretty well known, especially in ERs. So there's a shortage of 100,000 clinicians only in the United States. It's even worse in developing countries. In Israel, you wait 3.6 hours on average inside the ER. In the US, approximately the same numbers. In China, you can wait even 8 hours. There's planes flying people from one state to completely other one. Planes of sick people coming in, waiting 8 hours inside an ER. And most of the diagnostic, or most of the errors happening inside the ER are actually diagnostic errors. Now listen to the numbers. Around 40% of the errors are diagnostic errors. So you actually, there's a better chance of not going to the ER and surviving than actually going sometimes. So then we started a large project coming here on a national level. We contacted many hospitals here in Israel, including Rambam, Sheba, Soroka, Shaarei Tzedek. Ichilov is actually going to be running the system in live in the next few years as well, building a completely new ER room, totally driven by AI. We got access to 72 million patient records and started building an AI system that asks you questions, look at your medical file, starts sending you to additional diagnostic sensors inside the hospital, like X-ray, lab results, etc. And in each stage, creating an operating system inside the ER, building a full view to the doctors. So this is how it looks in Rambam. You come inside the Rambam, you just register, before seeing a nurse, before seeing a doctor, come to the station. There's a care navigator, usually a social worker, one per each 5 stations. You start filling in the different questions and answers. Behind the scenes, for the doctors, there's a huge television screen showing them everybody inside the ER, what they probably have, a medical summary. You know, every time you come to the doctor, they type something. That's it. The system is creating via natural language a full summary of what you have, documenting it. By the different clinical trials we've been doing right now, we saw that we're capable of saving 10 minutes per patient to the doctor. In the next few months, the system we were thinking is, why do this inside the ER? Maybe this is too late. Why not from home? So at this time, we're actually deploying this system to the different HMOs here in Israel, starting with Leumit. The second one is going to be Meuchedet, to start doing ERs from home. So I always say, how do you predict the future? Specifically in medicine, this is so hard. This is such a slow subject to actually move. But the best way to do this is actually create this. There's a slow pace of moving things from proof of concept to actually building systems that are working inside emergency rooms. So we're getting FDA for some of the system. The system is already partially FDA approved for some of its features. The other ones are running today in Cornell, Mayo, Maimonides inside the United States to actually get additional FDA approvals. But it turns out that AI is awesome, but it's not what doctors want. What doctors want is not to be replaced, but to actually many of their workflows automated. They don't want to talk to you and tell you, hey, you forgot to do this blood test. They don't want to talk to you and just type on the computer. They actually don't want to work with the computers in general. So what we're doing, we're not thinking about building the system to replace the doctors. We're just replacing a lot of the things they don't like doing. Typing, interviewing a patient for 20 minutes instead of just asking them two questions, making sure that when the patient comes to them, they already have all of the right lab results. So instead of aiming and saying, hey, we're just going to replace everybody and build a system that performs diagnosis, we're telling to which examination to send the patient, reading the results, and alerting them if there is somebody who's in danger. And I'll give you one example. A few months ago, in one of the hospitals running our system, a person came in before seeing a nurse, before seeing a doctor. He started working with the system, described the pain that's spreading from their abdomen towards their back. That time it was completely overcrowded inside the ER. The nurse was super busy. It would have taken him 45 minutes to see a nurse. The system immediately turned on a flag, saying it might be a dissection of the aorta. Dissection of the aorta is an extremely rare case. It only happens 10 times in Israel in a year. This system alerted one of the doctors, who immediately pulled him off the ER and saved his life. And this is the power. The power was not to produce the diagnosis, but the actual red flag. Okay. So, thank you. So if I can give you one more sentence is, try to think how you utilize all of this AI to do what actual doctors want and not what we want as researchers. Thank you so much.